6:30.
Contact center force. I see the
On
main
October
fleet
25,
bearing
1944,
040, approximately
Ensign William
30
Brooks
miles.
was flying routine anti-submarine patrol from the escort carrier USS Sancte.
Traverse 15
Low when he
degrees.
spotted something on the
Elevation
horizon
ready.
that made his blood freeze. Pagoda masts, the distinctive super ruptures of Japanese battleships emerging from the morning haze, TDing 17 miles to the northwest. Brooks blinked,
All
looked
right,
again.
fueling complete on the Avenger.
It had to be
Roger.
a mistake.
Let's get this panel
there
secured
they
before
were.
chow.
4 battleships, 6 maybe 8 cruisers, destroyers everywhere. A massive Japanese surface fleet where no Japanese fleet should be. He radioed back to his carrier. He was looking at a major Japanese force bearing down on him. Nobody believed him. It was impossible. On the bridge of the escort carrier, USS Fanshawe Bay, flagship of Task Unit 77. 4, 3, 4, 3, known by its radio call sign as Taffy, 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague
Maintain that
demanded
pressure on the
confirmation.
starboard side.
Japanese
Right,
battleships
securing
couldn't
the
be
shoring
here.
now. Move out.
Admiral William Hull's mighty Third Fleet, with its fast battleships and fleet carriers, was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino straight to the north. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, 7th Fleet battleships, had just annihilated a Japanese southern force at Suriga Strait hours earlier. Taffy 3 was in the safe zone, 60 mi east of Samar Island, launching routine ground support missions for the troops on leave, hunting submarines. This was supposed to be milk run duty, but Brooks wasn't seeing things.
Poor devils.
Coming through the morning mist
They
at
didn't make
27 knots was Vice Admiral Teo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the Battle of Midway. 4 battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. 6 heavy cruisers, Chikuma, Tona, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, and Haguro. 2 light cruisers, Yahagi and Noshiro. 11 destroyers, over 200,000 tons of warships. Leading them was Yamato herself, 72,000 tons, the largest battleship ever built. Her main battery consisted of 9 18, 1 in guns, the largest naval artillery ever put to sea. Each gun could fire a 300-ton shell over 25 meters. She carried over 125mm anti-aircraft guns. Her armor belt was 16 in thick. She was designed to fight and destroy any ship in the world. And she was heading straight for 6 escort carriers that were never meant to fight anything bigger than a submarine. Kurita's force had slipped through San Bernardino, straight in complete darkness at 3 o'clock a.m. Undetected and unopposed. The Japanese admiral couldn't believe his luck. He had expected to find the strait blocked by American battleships. Instead, it was empty. Hoel had taken the bait, racing north with his entire force to attack Admiral Ozawa's decoy carriers, leaving the back door to Lee Gulf wide open. Now Kurita was bearing down on the invasion beaches, where 130,000 American soldiers depended on naval support for survival. Standing between this armada and total disaster were the ships of Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, USS Fanshawe Bay, USS Saint. Below. USS White Plains, USS Kalanan Bay, USS Kitkin Bay, and USS Gambia Bay. 3 Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, USS Heermann. 4 destroyer escorts, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond. The carriers were Kaiser-built Casablanca-class ships constructed in shipyards that normally made cargo vessels. They were converted merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on top. Top speed 18 knots on a good day, about as fast as a loaded oil tanker. Their flight decks were wooden planks over thin steel. Their hulls had no armor worth mentioning. 5 in guns, 1 per ship, for anti-aircraft defense. They were never meant to fight surface ships. They were floating airfields designed to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious landings. Each carrier had about 30 aircraft, FM-2, Wildcat fighters, and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, but most were configured for ground support. Armed with rockets, small bombs, depth charges, maybe a dozen torpedoes total among all 6 carriers' air groups, not nearly enough to stop a battle fleet. The destroyers were the carrier's only real protection. USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann were Fletcher-class destroyers, 2,500 tons, 5 dual-purpose, 5 in guns, 10 torpedo tubes. They were fast, 38 knots at flank speed, but they were built for escort duty, not slugging matches with battleships. Their armor was measured in fractions of inches, just enough to keep out splinters. The destroyer escorts were even smaller. USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond were John C. Butler class, 1,700 tons, 2 Fianbon guns, 3 torpedo tubes. They were submarine hunters that had never trained for surface combat. Their crews called them tin cans because the hulls were so thin that near misses from large caliber shells could cave them in from water pressure alone. The mathematics were hopeless. The American force had guns that fired 54 low shells to a maximum range of 10 miles. The Japanese had guns that fired shells weighing over 3,000 pounds to ranges exceeding 25 meters. The Americans had about 24 torpedoes total. The Japanese had over 100. The American carriers could make 18 knots running for their lives. The Japanese ships could make 30 knots chasing them. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. At 6:45, lookouts on the escort carriers saw anti-aircraft burst to the north. Japanese float planes were already overhead, spotting for the incoming fleet. Admiral Sprague ordered all ships to general quarters, ordered a course change to the east, and told all carriers to launch every aircraft that could fly, armed or not, get them in the air. At 68, the northern horizon erupted in flame. The Japanese battle line had opened fire. The first salvos were from Yamato's 18-inch guns. Each shell weighed as much as a small car. They were armor-piercing, designed to punch through the 30-inch armor belts of American battleships. Against the unarmored escort carriers, they would pass clean through without exploding, unless they hit something substantial. But if they did explode inside the ship, one shell could tear a carrier in half. The Japanese ships used colored dye markers in their shells. Red from Yamato, yellow from Nagato, green from Haruna, blue from Congo. Different colors for the cruisers. It helped spotters identify which ship's shells were landing where. The sea around Taffy 3 erupted in colored waterspouts 200 feet tall. It was beautiful and terrifying. On the bridge of the escort carrier, White Plains, Captain Dennis Sullivan watched the colored geysers march toward his ship, red, yellow, green, walking closer with each salvo. He ordered his helmsman to steer toward the last splash. The theory was the Japanese wouldn't fire twice at the same spot. It was all they had. Admiral Sprague knew his carriers couldn't outrun the Japanese. He ordered them to turn southeast toward a rain squall on the horizon. Ordered all escorts to make smoke and sent out a plain language distress call that would become famous. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 20 m northwest of this unit, and closing. Request immediate assistance on the bridge of the destroyer, USS Johnston. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans didn't wait for orders. Evans was 36 years old, Cherokee and Creek from Porn, Oklahoma. He was one of the first Native Americans to graduate from the Naval Academy, class of 1931, and the first to command a destroyer. When he commissioned Johnston a year earlier at Seattle, he'd gathered his crew and told them, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Now, without waiting for the order to attack, Evans commanded all ahead flank full left rudder. USS Johnston, 2,200 tons, was turning toward 4 battleships, displacing over 200,000 tons combined. One destroyer against the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was suicide. But Evans understood something the mathematics didn't capture. Every minute the Japanese spent dealing with his ship was a minute the carriers could run. Every shell fired at Johnston was a shell not fired at the carriers with their 900-man crews. And in the rain, squalls and smoke that were beginning to obscure the battlefield. Aggressive action might create confusion. At 7:10, Johnston was making smoke, laying a thick black screen between the Japanese and the carriers. Her 5-inch guns were firing at maximum rate at the heavy cruiser Kumano, the closest Japanese ship at 14,000 runs. The 5-inch shells couldn't penetrate Kumano's 8-inch armor belt, but they could wreck her superstructure, destroy her fire control, kill exposed crew. Johnston zigzagged toward the Japanese fleet, chasing shell splashes, using smoke for concealment. At 10,000 yards maximum torpedo range, Evans launched his 10 Mark 15 torpedoes at Kumano, then kept closing, kept firing. The 5-inch guns were firing so fast, the paint was burning off the barrels. In few minutes, Johnston pumped over 200 shells into the heavy cruiser. At 7:24, Kumano seemed to explode. Multiple torpedo hits, either 1 or 3, depending on the source, blew her bow completely off. She sheared out of formation, crippled, taking the heavy cruiser Suzuya with her as an escort. In his first attack, Evans had removed 2 heavy cruisers from the battle. But now, Johnston was alone, 7,000 yards from the Japanese battle line. She'd been spotted. The battleship Yamato opened fire with her secondary battery of 6-in guns. 3 shells hit simultaneously. The impacts were catastrophic. One shell destroyed the after engine room, cutting Johnston's speed in half. Another wrecked the after 5-in gun mount. The third hit the bridge. Commander Evans was torn apart. 2 fingers of his left hand were blown off. His shirt was burned completely away. Shrapnel wounds covered his neck, chest, and legs. Blood streamed down his body. His communications officer and several others were killed instantly. But Evans stayed at his post, wrapping his shirt around his wounded hand, continuing to con his ship. More shells followed. 14-in shells from the battleship Congo. 8-in shells from multiple cruisers. They tore through Johnston like she was made of tissue paper. The forward engine room was destroyed. Electrical power failed. The gyro compass tumbled. Steering control was lost from the bridge. But somehow Johnston stayed afloat, stayed in the fight. Evans shifted steering control to the after steering compartment, shouting orders through an open hatch while men manually turned the rudder. Back on the carriers, pilots were launching in anything that could fly. Many of the Avengers hadn't been loaded with torpedoes. They were configured for ground support with 100-pound general-purpose bombs, rockets, even depth charges. The Wildcats had only their 50-caliber machine guns. But they took off anyway, forming up, heading for the Japanese fleet. At 7:16, Admiral Sprague gave the order every destroyer captain had been waiting for. Small boys attack. Launch torpedo attack. The little ships were going in on the destroyer USS Hull. Commander Leon Kentberger ordered flank speed. Hull had been the flagship of the destroyer screen, but her talk between ships radio was malfunctioning, so tactical command had passed to Johnston. Now charged toward the nearest battleship, Congo, 18,000 wide away, 35 knots through a hurricane of steel. Japanese shells walked up Hull's wake, each salvo closer than the last. Red dye from Yamato, green from Haruna, blue from Congo. The columns of water towered over the destroyer's bridge. At 14,000 miles, still at extreme range, Kentberger launched half his torpedoes at Congo. The battleship saw them coming, turned away. All 5 torpedoes missed. Hell kept closing. At 9,000 bodied, she launched her remaining 5 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Haguro, then opened fire with her 5-in guns. The torpedoes missed again, but they forced Haguro to evade, disrupting her fire. Then the Japanese found Hull's range. Multiple ships converged their fire on the destroyer. 16-in shells from Yamato, 14-in shells from Congo, 8-in shells from Haguro and Tone. They literally tore Hull apart. Her port engine was destroyed. Her rudder jammed. Her guns were knocked out one by one. She was flooding from dozens of holes. In 40 minutes, she took over 40 hits from major caliber shells. But she had accomplished her mission. She had forced the Japanese to maneuver, disrupted their formation, bought precious minutes for the carriers to escape into a providential rain squall that was moving across the battlefield. The destroyer, USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Howe, had started the battle on the disengaged side of the formation, the side away from the Japanese. Now she raced at flank speed through the American formation to get into the fight. Visibility was down to a few hundred yards in the smoke and rain. Haman nearly collided with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, backing emergency full to avoid her. Then she almost hit. It was controlled chaos. Ships maneuvering desperately in near-zero visibility. Haman emerged from the smoke screen to find herself facing 4 Japanese battleships in column. Congo leading, then Haruna, then Nagato, then the mighty Yamato herself. Commander Hathaway didn't hesitate. He ordered his destroyer straight at them. At 10,000 Oahu, Hathaway launched 3 torpedoes at Congo. The battleship evaded. At 4,400 Humiliated, suicidally close to battleships that could obliterate his ship with a single salvo, Hathaway launched 3 more torpedoes at Haruna. The battleship emergency turned to avoid them. Then Haman fired her last torpedoes at Yamato. What happened next changed the battle. Yamato's lookout spotted the torpedo wakes. Admiral Kurita, who had transferred his flag to Yamato, after his original flagship was sunk by American submarines 2 days earlier, ordered the massive battleship to turn north to evade. But the torpedoes kept coming and Yamato kept running. For 10 critical minutes, the most powerful battleship in the world with the Japanese admiral aboard was heading away from the battle. By the time Kurita got Yamato turned around, the engagement had transformed into a confused melee. Meanwhile, the destroyer escorts were attacking. On USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland had been listening to the radio chatter. He could hear the destroyers engaging. Here, Admiral Sprague ordering torpedo attacks. Copeland was 34 years old from Tacoma, Washington. His ship was built to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. But when the order came for the destroyer escorts to attack, Copeland grabbed the ship's intercom. Men, he said, the enemy force is now bearing 085s, distance 7 miles.
We're going in.
This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The crew of Samuel B. Roberts had been at general quarters since before dawn. They could see the colored shell splashes walking closer to the carriers. They could hear the rumble of heavy guns that sounded like freight trains passing overhead. They knew what Copeland was telling them. They were going to die, but they were going to die fighting. Copeland ordered all the head flank. The destroyer escort's engines designed for 24 knots were pushed past their limits. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Robert Trowbridge somehow got 28 knots out of them. The entire ship vibrated like it would shake apart. The deck plates flexed. The engines screamed. But Samuel B. Roberts charged toward the Japanese fleet. At 4,000 altitude from the heavy cruiser Chokai, impossibly close range, Roberts launched her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes. Then she opened fire with her 2 5-inch guns. The first salvo missed. The second hit, then another, and another. The little destroyer escort was pumping armor-piercing shells into a heavy cruiser at point-blank range. The Japanese returned fire. 8-inch shells from Chokai, 14-inch shells from Congo. But at such close range, the Japanese ships couldn't depress their guns enough to hit the tiny destroyer escort. Shells passed overhead or punched through the ship without exploding. In gun mount 52 after on Samuel B. Roberts, gunner's mate, 3rd class Paul Henry Carr, was performing miracles. Carr was 20 years old from Chakakota, Oklahoma. His gun crew was firing 6 rounds per minute, twice the designed rate. Each 54 AU shell had to be manually loaded, manually rammed. The gun was so hot that shells were starting to cook off from the heat. The compressed air system that cleared powder gases from the breech had failed. But Carr's crew kept loading, kept firing. At 8:15, the battle had become total chaos. Rain squalls and smoke had reduced visibility to hundreds of yards in some places. Ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Japanese ships were firing at each other in the confusion. American destroyers were weaving between shell splashes, darting in to fire their 5-inch guns, then disappearing back into the smoke. Admiral Kurita was confused. His lookouts were reporting they were fighting fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The silhouettes didn't match anything in Japanese recognition manuals. These little escort carriers, displacing 8,000 tons, were being reported as 30,000-ton Essex-class fleet carriers. The destroyers were being reported as cruisers. Kurita thought he had stumbled into a task group from Holz's 3rd Fleet. The confusion was compounded by Kurita's order for general attack instead of a coordinated battle line. Each division was operating independently. Ships were getting in each other's way. The destroyer divisions had been ordered to the rear just when they should have been pressing torpedo attacks. It was tactical chaos. Meanwhile, the American pilots were attacking with everything they had. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, Air Group Op Commander from the escort carrier Gambia Bay, made 10 attack runs against Japanese ships without any ammunition at all. He would dive at a cruiser or battleship, pull up at the last second, circle around, and do it again. When he finally landed on the escort carrier Manila Bay, his Avenger had over 200 bullet holes in it. But his dry runs had forced Japanese ships to maneuver, throwing off their aim. Other pilots were strafing battleships with 50 caliber machine guns, hoping to damage fire control equipment. Some dropped 100 Blausom anti-personnel bombs on cruiser decks. One pilot dropped a depth charge on a destroyer. It didn't do much damage, but it added to the confusion. At 8:30, USS Hell was finished. Surrounded by Japanese ships, hit over 40 times, engines destroyed, guns knocked out. She was a burning, sinking wreck. Commander Kentberger gave the order to abandon ship. Hell rolled over and sank at 8-5. Of her crew of 39, only 86 survived. 253 men died with their ship. At 8-fu, Samuel B. Roberts took 3 8-inch shells in rapid succession. One tore a hole 40 feet long in her port side at the waterline. Another destroyed what was left of her engine power. The third was a direct hit on gun mount 52. The explosion was catastrophic. Most of Gunner's mate Carr's 10-man crew was killed instantly. Carr himself was ripped open from neck to groin. His internal organs were exposed. He was dying. Would be dead in minutes, but he was still conscious. A repair party found him holding a 54 Tulalu shell against what was left of his chest, begging someone to help him load it to fire one more round. He died holding that shell. His gun mount had fired over 300 rounds in 35 minutes, most of them after power was lost. All hand-loaded, hand-aimed. The barrel was warped from the heat of continuous firing. At 9:05, Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. Lieutenant Commander Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. The destroyer escort rolled over and sank at 10 OPAs. 589. Of her 1 to 8-man crew went down with the ship. Back on Johnston, Commander Evans was still fighting despite his wounds. With 1 engine, 3 guns out of action, and steering control lost, he had shifted command to the after steering station. Men were manually cranking the rudder, while Evans shouted orders through an open hatch. Blood from his wounds had pooled on the deck around him. At 8:20, Johnston emerged from her smoke screen to find herself facing a Congo-class battleship at 7,000 horses. Without hesitation, Evans ordered his remaining guns to open fire. For the next 40 minutes, the crippled destroyer engaged in a point-blank gun duel with a battleship. Her 5-inch shells couldn't penetrate Congo's armor, but Evans wasn't trying to sink her. He was trying to distract her, to ruin her fire control, to keep her from accurately targeting the carriers. At 9 o'clock, Japanese destroyers had closed in on Johnston, surrounding her, pumping shells into her from all sides. She had no power, no guns still functioning, was flooding rapidly. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. He was last seen on the fantail, helping wounded sailors into life rafts, still giving orders despite his wounds. His body was never found. As Johnston sank at 9:10, something extraordinary happened. The Japanese destroyer, Yukikaze, was passing close by. Her captain ordered his crew to stand at attention and salute the sinking American destroyer. Even the enemy recognized courage when they saw it. The escort carrier Gambia Bay was in trouble. She'd been taking hits for over an hour. Shells from Yamato, from Chikuma, from multiple other ships. She was the rearmost carrier, the closest to the pursuing Japanese. An 8-inch shell from Chikuma had penetrated to her engine room. She was losing speed, falling behind the others. At 9:07, Gambia Bay capsized to port and sank. She was the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. 131 of her crew died, but she had lasted over 2 hours under fire from battleships. 2 hours that allowed 5 other carriers to escape. By 9 o'clock a.m., 3 Japanese heavy cruisers were out of action. Chokai was burning from bomb hits and the pounding she'd taken from Samuel B. Roberts. Kumano was crippled from Johnston's torpedo attack. Chikuma had been hit by over 305-inch shells from the American destroyers and was now taking torpedo attacks from carrier aircraft. At 9:11, something unexpected happened. Admiral Kurita ordered his ships to cease fire and withdraw to the north. After 2 hours and 35 minutes of battle, just when the Japanese seemed on the verge of breaking through to the defenseless transports at Lee, Kurita turned away. Why? Historians still debated. Kurita would later claim he received reports of American carriers to the north, though no such reports were ever found in DT, Japanese records. He claimed he was low on fuel, though his ships had enough to continue operations. He claimed he thought he'd already sunk several fleet carriers and achieved his objective. The truth was probably more complex. Kurita was exhausted. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His original flagship, the heavy cruiser Atargo, had been torpedoed and sunk by the American submarines Dart and Dace on October 23rd. He'd been forced to swim for his life, was rescued, then transferred to Yamato. He'd lost the super battleship Musashi to air attacks on October 24th. Now he'd lost 3 heavy cruisers with 3 more damaged. More importantly, Kurita had lost tactical control of the battle. His forces were scattered. Yamato's 10-minute run to the north had taken him out of command. Communications were poor. He didn't know where half his ships were. American air attacks were intensifying. Every few minutes, more planes appeared, forcing his ships to maneuver, disrupting their formations. And there was the psychological factor. The Americans weren't acting like a defeated force. Destroyers don't charge battleships unless they're screening something important. Carriers don't turn toward the enemy unless they have support coming. The sheer aggression of the American attack, the willingness to die rather than run, created an illusion that Kurita was facing the vanguard of a larger force, not a handful of escorts making a last stand. At 9:28 it was over. The Japanese were withdrawing. The survivors of Taffy 3 watched the pagoda masts disappear into the northern horizon, unable to believe they were still alive. They had faced a force with 10 times their firepower, and somehow survived. But the cost had been terrible. USS Johnston was gone with 141 dead, including Commander Evans. USS Hell was gone with 83 dead. USS Samuel B. Roberts was gone with 89 dead. USS Gambia Bay was gone with 31 dead. Hundreds more were wounded. The survivors from the sunken ships faced a new ordeal. They would spend 50 hours in shark-infested waters before being rescued. Many had been wounded in the battle. Some died waiting for rescue. Men went mad from thirst and drank sea otter. Sharks took others. The men from Samuel B. Roberts tied themselves together in groups so they wouldn't drift apart. They sang songs, told jokes, anything to keep spirits up. When rescue finally came, many were too weak to climb the rope ladders. An hour after the surface battle ended, the first kamikaze attacks in history struck Taffy 3. The escort carrier St. Lo was hit by a Zero carrying a bomb. The explosion detonated the ship's magazine. She sank in 30 minutes with Wade dead. The carriers that had survived battleships couldn't survive a single determined pilot, but that's another story. The Battle of Samar was over, but its effects rippled across the Pacific War. The Japanese combined fleet never mounted another major offensive operation. They had been turned back by ships that shouldn't have been able to turn back a fishing fleet, let alone the pride of the Imperial Navy. Admiral Kurita would survive the war, lived to be 88 years old, dying in 1977. He would give interviews, write articles, try to explain what happened off Samar, but he could never adequately explain why he turned away when the American transports were within his grasp. The best he could offer was that he thought he'd done enough damage that further losses weren't worth it. In a 1953 article, he would admit that the American defense was so valiant and skillful that he believed he was facing a much stronger force. The Americans couldn't believe what they'd accomplished. Admiral Sprague would later write that the survival of his force could only be attributed to the special dispensation of Almighty God. Admiral Nimitz called it the finest hour of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Halsey, when he learned what had happened, reportedly wept. His decision to chase the Japanese decoy force had nearly led to disaster. Only the courage of Taffy 3 had saved the invasion. Commander Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The citation reads in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the Battle of Samar." Without waiting for orders, Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, launching the first torpedo attack when the Johnston came under straddling Japanese shellfire. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland was awarded the Navy Cross. Gunner's mate, 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. In 1985, the Navy commissioned a guided missile frigate named USS Carr in his honor. One of the few ships ever named for an enlisted sailor. But these men wouldn't have wanted medals. They would have said they were just doing their jobs. They all would have said that. The men who charged battleships and destroyers, the men who kept loading guns with their dying breath, the men who flew unarmed planes at enemy ships. They weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying to protect the carriers, the transports, the soldiers on the beach. They were doing what the moment demanded, what their shipmates needed, what their country required. The Japanese had called them tin cans as an insult. These weren't real warships, just cheap escorts with thin armor and small guns. The Americans had embraced the term tin can sailors. They called themselves with pride. And those tin cans had hearts of iron. When faced with annihilation, they didn't run, they attacked. And in attacking, in choosing death over dishonor, they achieved immortality. The statistics tell part of the story. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts against 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1 in ships, 10-1 in tonnage, 20-1 in firepower. They should have been annihilated in minutes. Instead, they fought for 2.5 hours, sank 3 heavy cruisers, damaged 3 more, and turned back the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled since Midway. But statistics don't measure courage. They don't quantify determination. They can't calculate the power of men who know they're going to die, but attack anyway. The tin cans of Taffy 3 proved that sometimes, against all odds, against all logic, against all reasonable expectation, courage is enough. There's a memorial now at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego. A simple granite stone listing 3 ships, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, USS Samuel B. Roberts. Most people who pass it don't know what those names mean. Don't know that on October 25th, 1944, those ships charged into certain death and somehow saved an army. Every year on October 25th, a few old men used to gather there. Survivors of Taffy 3. They would read the names of the dead, tell the old stories. Remember, there aren't many left now. The last survivor of Samuel B. Roberts, a Dread Lenoir, died in March 2022 at age 97.
Time has done what Japanese shells couldn't.
But the story lives on. In November 2019, the research vessel Petrol, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's estate, found wreckage from one of the destroyers at 2180 feet. Using a remotely operated vehicle, they captured haunting images of gun mounts, torpedo tubes, and the ship's bell. In March 2021, it was positively proto-identified as USS Johnston through her hull number 57 visible on the wreckage. At that time, she was the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. She's broken in half where she was hit by 18 shells from Yamato, split at frame 130, where the massive shell detonated. Her forward section lies upright, her 5 gun mount still trained outboard as if ready to engage. Her bridge structure is gone, destroyed in the battle, taking Commander Evans's last stand with it. But her guns still point outward, defiant to the end, eternal sentinels in the darkness. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vesco and his team aboard the research vessel Pressure Drop found USS Samuel B. Roberts at 22,061 foot, breaking Johnston's record as the deepest shipwreck ever found. The images were remarkable. Her guns, too, are still pointed toward the enemy, frozen in their last moments of battle. The torpedo tubes are empty. There, lethal cargo expended in that desperate charge. You can see where the massive hole was blown in her side, where the 8 shells tore through her engine room. But she sits upright, proud, still ready to fight, still defending the carriers she died to protect. The destroyer escort that fought like a battleship forever on watch in the dark Pacific depths. Finding these wrecks was more than archaeology. For the families of the men who died, it was closure. They finally knew where their loved ones rested. For the Navy, it was validation of a legendary story. The wreck showed the damage described in survivor accounts proved the intensity of the battle. For historians, it was confirmation of details long debated. And for all of us, it was a reminder that the ocean floor is a vast cemetery filled with the vessels and men who gave everything for their country. USS Hell has never been found. She lies somewhere in 20,000 foot of water off Samar, her exact location unknown. But her story, like those of Johnston and Roberts, will never be forgotten. Not as long as there are sailors in the United States Navy who remember what courage means. The destroyer, USS Heermann, survived the battle, the only destroyer of Taffy 3 to do so. Despite taking major damage, she was repaired and went on to serve through the rest of the war. She earned the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy Unit Commendation, and 5 battle stars. In 1961, she was transferred to Argentina and served as Aura Almirante Brown until 1982. The last of the tin cans that faced down battleships finally retired after 4 decades of service. The escort carriers all survived except Gambia Bay and St. Lo, but they bore the scars. Kalanan Bay took 15 hits. White Plains was straddled so many times her plates were sprung from near misses. Fansaw Bay had shells pass completely through her. They were patched up, sent back into service, continued operating until war's end. Ships that were never meant to see combat had stood up to battleships and lived. Taffy 3 was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation reads in part, for extraordinary heroism in action against powerful units of the Japanese fleet during the Battle of Samar. The gallant ships of Task Unit 7, 4, 3 waged battle fiercely against the superior speed and firepower of the advancing enemy. 2 of the unit's valiant destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged the battleships point blank, and expending their last torpedoes in desperate defense of the entire group, went down under the enemy's heavy shells. The courageous determination and the superb teamwork of the officers and men who fought the embarked planes and who manned the ships of Task Unit 77, 4, 3, 4, 3 were instrumental in effecting the retirement of a hostile force threatening our later invasion operations, and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. But that's military language, formal and proper. The real story is simpler. When faced with impossible odds, ordinary sailors became extraordinary. When ordered to buy time with their lives, they bought it. When the moment demanded heroes, they became heroes. Not because they wanted glory, but because that's what needed to be done. The Japanese perspective on the battle reveals how completely the American attack disrupted their plans. Vice Admiral Mate Yugaki, commanding the battleship division that included Yamato, wrote in his diary that the spirit of all-out attack at short range was lacking in the Japanese force. They had superior firepower, but couldn't coordinate it. Captain Toshio Abe of the heavy cruiser Tone later admitted they were completely confused by the American tactics. "We thought we were fighting fleet carriers and cruisers," he said. "The destroyers attacked so aggressively, we assumed they must be screening capital ships." The Japanese communications during the battle showed their confusion. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese lookouts reporting they were engaging Task Force 38, Ho's main carrier force. They reported sinking Essex-class carriers, Baltimore-class cruisers. They couldn't comprehend that these tiny ships would attack so ferociously unless they were protecting something vital. The aggression itself became a weapon, creating an illusion of strength that didn't exist. Vice Admiral Kurita's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomigi Koyanagi, later wrote that the American destroyer attacks were so determined and pressed home so vigorously that they created an impression of a much larger force. The smoke screens, the constant air attacks, the torpedoes coming from multiple directions, it all combined to create chaos in the Japanese command structure. "No heed was taken of order or coordination," Koyanagi admitted. Each unit operated independently, which dispersed our overwhelming advantage in Koyanagi of firepower. The Japanese also suffered from a critical intelligence failure. Their recognition manuals didn't include the Casablanca-class escort carriers. These were new ships mass-reduced in American shipyards, something the Japanese couldn't conceive of. How could the Americans build carriers so quickly? They must be fleet carriers, the Japanese officers reasoned. No navy would defend 8,000-ton merchant conversion so desperately. The very desperation of the American defense convinced the Japanese they were facing something important. There was also the human factor. Admiral Kurita had been at sea for 5 days. He'd been swimming for his life when American submarines sank his flagship. He'd watched the super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy, sink under American air attacks. He'd lost sleep, lost ships, lost confidence. When faced with an enemy that wouldn't retreat, that kept attacking despite overwhelming odds, something in him broke. The Americans were supposed to run. They always ran from superior forces. But these Americans attacked. It didn't make sense unless they knew something. He didn't. Unless help was coming. Unless this was a trap. After the battle, Japanese naval officers would study what went wrong. How could the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled be turned back by a handful of escorts? The official reports blame poor communications, lack of coordination, mechanical failures. But privately, many Japanese officers admitted the truth. They had been psychologically defeated. The American willingness to die rather than retreat had shaken them. As one Japanese destroyer captain later said, "We had the guns, but they had the spirit." In war, sometimes spirit is enough. The aftermath of the battle rippled through both navies. For the Americans, it became a legend, a touchstone of naval courage. The Naval Academy started teaching it as an example of what determination could accomplish. Destroyer School used it to show young officers that aggressive action could overcome superior forces. The Tenon sailors became heroes not just for what they did, but for what they represented. The idea that ordinary sailors could rise to extraordinary heights when the moment demanded it. For years after the war, the survivors would gather. They would meet in San Diego, in Houston, in Washington. They would remember shipmates who didn't make it home. They would argue about details. Who fired first? Which torpedo hit which ship? When exactly did Kurita turn away? But they all agreed on the important things. They had done their duty. They had protected the carriers. They had saved the invasion. And they had done it not because they were special, but because that's what needed to be done. Robert Copeland, who survived the battle, spent years speaking at naval events. He would always emphasize that the heroes were the men who didn't come back. Paul Carr loading shells with his dying breath. Ernest Evans bleeding on his bridge, but still fighting. The nameless sailors who stayed at their posts as their ships sank. They were the real heroes, Copeland would say. The rest of us just did our jobs. The battle also changed naval doctrine. It proved that aggressive action by smaller forces could disrupt larger ones. It showed the importance of initiative at the tactical level. It demonstrated that technology and firepower weren't everything. That human factors like courage, determination, and leadership could be decisive. Military colleges around the world still study it as an example of asymmetric warfare. How a weaker force can defeat a stronger one through superior tactics and will. The Battle of Samar also highlighted the importance of air power. Even though the escort carriers' planes weren't properly armed for ship attack, their constant harassment helped drive off the Japanese fleet. It showed that carriers, even small ones, had become the dominant force in naval warfare. After Samar, no one could argue that battleships still ruled the seas. The age of the carrier had truly arrived. Years later, a Japanese officer who survived the battle was asked about the American destroyers. He shook his head in wonder. They fought like battleships, he said. We couldn't believe such small ships would attack us. They came through their own smoke, firing everything they had. They wouldn't stop. Even when we had them surrounded, they kept fighting. We had to respect such courage. In all my years in the Imperial Navy, I never saw anything like it. That's the real lesson of the Battle of Samar. Not that David can beat Goliath, though sometimes he can. Not that courage can overcome overwhelming odds, though sometimes it does. The lesson is that ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances can choose to be heroes. Can choose to charge when retreat makes sense. Can choose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. The Japanese had every advantage except one. They were fighting Americans who wouldn't quit. Tin can sailors who knew they were going to die and attacked anyway. Men like Paul Carr, who kept firing after he should have been dead. Men like Ernest Evans, who turned a destroyer into a battleship through sheer will. Men like Robert Copeland, who told his crew the truth and then led them into legend. Men like Amos Hathaway, who charged 4 battleships with 1 destroyer and forced the mighty Yamato to run. In the end, that made all the difference. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts against the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Tin Cans won. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. These forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to hear more untold stories from World War II. Each one matters. Each one teaches us something about courage, about sacrifice, about what ordinary people can do when history demands heroes. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. From Manila to Memphis, from Tokyo to Toronto, from Sydney to San Diego, we're united in remembering those who gave everything when everything was at stake.
Thank you for watching.
If you want to continue discovering the quieter but powerful stories behind World War II, consider subscribing to Silent Horrorco. Every subscription helps us bring more depth and perspective to these historical events. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me which moment or story you would like to explore next. Your feedback shapes the direction of future videos.